Hey everybody, this is Alex and Ilya from NEAR, and we're here with Anatoly from Solana to do a super deep dive and discuss really intense details about their protocol. Anatoly, you want to give a short intro about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Anatoly. I'm the founder CEO of Solana. Solana is a very high performance blockchain that does no sharding, opposite of NEAR. So I love to argue with these guys about technology.
All right, let's start with kind of you describe us at high level, and then we'll go really deep.
Sure. So at a very high level, Solana is based around this idea that you can use a clock, a global clock, to speed up a distributed system. And this idea has been around for like a really long time, since the 40s. And our clock is permissionless. So what's interesting about our clock is that it actually works before consensus. Like before you actually have any notion of agreement in the system, you still have a notion of time. And that's why we can actually leverage that to speed up the network. So that's kind of like the very shallow deep dive. So how does our clock work? So I think if you guys have been following the space in the last year, there's been kind of this explosion of ideas around verifiable delay functions, or VDFs. I actually didn't know anything about VDFs when I came up with this. I just had too much coffee, and I was up till 4 in the morning. And our clock is maybe the simplest way you can implement a VDF. So imagine you have a SHA-256. Any cryptographic pre-image resistant hash functions would work, and this thing just loops over itself, right? So it keeps going and going and going. And every X amount of iterations, you just take a sample. So when I mean loops over itself, its output is the next input. Just recursively just runs. Because it's pre-image resistant, you can't predict any of the values that are going to occur, like 100 million iterations from now. You actually have to run this thing in a single core, single process, without stopping. So, let's say this is like, 1 million iterations and the value is like 0, B, I, A, whatever, right? This is 2 million, the value is like 0, C, D, F, dot. Right? And it just keeps going forever. So these samples represent a data structure that tells you that somebody somewhere spent real time building it. So what's interesting about this data structure is you can encode messages into it. So I can simply take a message or a big blob of data and hash it, and then kind of stick it in here before we do this iteration. So now I have some value here, right? Some bits that I've inserted here. So now at this point, all the subsequent hashes have been modified in an unpredictable way because it's pre-image resistant. So what also is interesting is if this thing itself also contained a reference to some other value that it observed. So now this guarantees that this message was created after this point and before this point. So now we have this data structure, right, that encodes time, but also an order of events and the relative order between them, as well as the relative amount of time between them, right? So we call this thing proof of history because it gives you a proof of a historical record. So now imagine you have this data structure that I sent to you guys, with a thumb drive attached to a carrier pigeon, right? And you're looking at this data structure, right? And this is like the head pointer. This is the last thing you see. And somewhere here you see a network message. Somewhere here you see a network message. Somewhere here you see like network messages, right? So given this last thing that you've observed, you can compute whatever algorithm you choose, the active set of the network, right?
What's the set of the network?
Whatever algorithm you choose. You could say that somebody had to have sent like a message once over the last 2 weeks, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Whatever, it doesn't matter what it is. You pick some algorithm, right? But the point is that at this point in the ledger, right, at this point in history, which is identified by the count, right? 1 billion and some value, 0x, blah, 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 FE. You've decided that this is the state of the network. So what's interesting is that everyone else observing this data structure using the same algorithm will decide the exact same state of the network. And if we optimistically assume that everybody's looking at this thing, then this is how we cheat the two generals problem, right? If everybody optimistically assumes that they're looking at this thing, they construct a message that references this value that's only valid if it appears sometime later, right? And we say we attack, right? Everybody attacks. And if we're lucky and everyone did actually observe the same thing, we will see that as evidence here by a bunch of messages to indicate the attack, which is concluded from the exact same information that everyone observed. So that's fundamentally how our system works, is that based on this historical record, which is now cryptographic, it's not just, timestamps that I etched in the, in bits, right, and made up. We can actually come to agreement about the state of the network and therefore make a decision, and that decision is consistent along with everyone else, optimistically.
Right. And so you're saying we're cheating to generals problem.
Yeah.
So you're saying that Solana would survive even if we have more than 1/3 of malicious actors?
So you can't, there's no solution to the two generals problem,
Okay.
right? You can only cheat it.
Right, but do you think that with this cheat, it would be safe even if there's let's say 40% of
Well,
malicious actors?
it doesn't matter how many malicious actors there are, because the way you win the two generals problem is I don't say
Or two
that.
generals problem. Sorry, I'm thinking of
The n generals problem,
Yeah.
doesn't matter. The way we actually solve it is when we look at this point here, we say that we solved it here, right? But whatever, 1 hour later we decide, oh yeah, we did actually solve it and here's the proof, right? Because the system then has evidence that it did come to agreement here and it has multiple confirmations. And our system, just like proof of work, the deeper this event occurs, the harder it is to unroll.
Yeah.
So I can kind of dive into that.
So you may have a bunch of forks, but presumably 1 hour later they will resolve
they all
one
die.
way or another.
Yeah.
But so let's say hypothetically, the person who runs the proof of history is malicious, and he has 2 cores, let's say.
Yeah.
And so he has a second core where he computes the same thing, but he misses one message.
Yeah, so that's fine. So we can kind of get into the consensus part if you guys want.
So this part, so this part is orthogonal to consensus.
Yeah.
It's just a way for us to have evidence that the message happened.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
because once you observe the structure, you don't really care how it was generated, whether it was multiple liters, 2 liters, 1, doesn't matter, right? Kind of the data, everything about the network is derived from the data itself. So
Right.
there's no weak subjectivity.
And so I, as a person who received this thumb drive, how do I verify that all the hashes were computed correctly?
So that's where you take your GPU card that you buy at Fry's. You look at each slice in between here, right? And then you use 1 core on every slice, and about 4,000 slices you can verify it in one loop. So 1 second can be verified in about a quarter millisecond.
Okay, so with 1 GPU, we will be verifying 4,000 times faster.
Yeah.
So but
With 4 GPUs, you're 16,000 times faster. Kind of if you look at your entry-level Ethereum mining rig has 12 GPUs in there, right?
and then for safety, so let's say I'm planning to run some sort of exchange, and I need to be absolutely certain, there's nothing weird happening. I need to verify everything from the Genesis block.
Depends. That's that is a complicated thing.
But
That's a complicated question.
If it's been 4 years since the Genesis block, I will verify it in 1/3 of a day, right?
Depends on your GPU capacity.
Okay, if it's
because
4,000,
it's parallelizable, right?
That sounds reasonable. That's
Right.
about how much time it takes to sync to Ethereum anyway.
But in 1 hour, you could spin up 100 GPUs on Google Cloud and verify everything.
Yeah,
Right.
makes sense.
But so for verifying, you still need to have the checkpoints relatively frequently. So how big is that data structure?
We are generating maybe at most 2,000 per second. And that's simply because, so our kind of target is 1 gigabit. UDP packets are 64 kilobytes. You can generate 2,000 of them per second.
Oh, 2,000 checkpoint hashes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hashes or checkpoints?
it's the same thing.
Okay,
It's
so
a hash.
Because every time you encode the message, which is like a data packet, you need to record the state and the counter. when
Yeah.
you do
But
it.
how many hashes does a single core compute per second?
Oh, for about 3 million, I think.
3 million hashes?
It might be more now. There's we haven't measured it, but like AMD's Threadripper has SHA-256 specific instructions.
Right. And so Justin Drake is very into VDFs these days, right?
Yeah.
So they want to build this ASIC that will be computing some other VDF, not this one.
Yeah, so
Right.
so our VDF is extremely simple. It doesn't do anything fancy. What they're doing is something that, given like let's say 10 seconds worth of data, the verification time is maybe constant or fast like polynomial.
Yeah.
Like, so the difference there is that ours grows linearly. Verification time is linear to the CPU time necessary to verify. But CPUs double in cores every 2 years, so I think by the time they ship V0 of their hardware, we would be like at 8,000 cores, right, per GPU card.
But then I think, unless I remember it wrong, Justin mentioned in one of the podcasts that Solana wants to participate with
Yes.
them.
Yeah.
But what's your interest if you're using a different VDF?
Why wouldn't we swap it for something
I
that's
see.
algorithmically better? Like
Makes sense.
we're not like we don't care, right?
You know,
Yeah,
married
sure.
to a specific function.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But you would need. But the properties you want from VDF are very different from what they want, right? You want it to be, you want the VDF to be producing values 2,000 times per second, while their use case is like.
Our main like problem with the stuff is still in research. Is like they're using snarks and starks, and so the complicated things there is setup. So their approach may use a large MPC group, but it's like effectively like a snark style setup.
Yeah.
You either need a trusted group, so you need to make it huge, or you need some other mechanism to create like kind of the initial seed, such that you know that this wasn't pre-computed before.
Right.
For us, because we're using SHA-256, very, very dumb. It is, to somebody that's been working on operating systems, it's very transparent what it does. Their setup requires this like kind of like, magic ceremony, right?
So that's as they use a snark setup, yeah.
Yeah.
As they do, presumably snarks now, you can.
I think they use neither. They just computing some arithmetic operation.
Their operation requires a setup right now.
They need a semi-prime, right?
Yeah.
So they need a semi-prime, which is.
Well, yeah, they're using a prime version of the hash function they use is like Peterson. Well, I'm speculating here, but if you're assuming Peterson commitment hash function and you compute it many times, you can compute a snark of that very easily. That proves that you didn't done this computation this many times.
Sure.
So you presumably do that.
That's the one part that's complicated. The other part is what we're doing is biasing the input. Every time you have a message in the network, we stick it into this loop, right?
Mm-hmm.
The frequency of that we can make it work with whatever function they do, but our main concern here is a security concern. Is if you can bias this input, you can potentially generate a hash function. If this is not pre-image secure, right? If this is not pre-image resistant, when you do this message recording, we want this part to be guaranteed to be secure, such that you can't like generate a loop.
Yep.
I think. Well, I've talked to Justin. He feels confident that we can get our stuff working with theirs. I trust his opinion. I'm happy to switch. Yeah, that's not a problem.
Cool. Okay, so let's say we have the clock.
Okay.
What do we do next?
Okay, so the main part about why things can be fast with a clock, right, is because when you do this active set computation, you're doing this without messaging anyone, right? You got this data structure from a carrier pigeon with a thumb drive. You don't have to talk to anyone else in the network. You actually do this computation locally, and that's the speed up, right? Because now there's no interactive thing that you have to do with anyone else. simply optimistically guess that I've downloaded the right structure, right, and I'm going to send it. So that should kind of intuitively tell you why it's fast, right?
Sort of.
So the second part of why we can leverage this uses that point is because in our setup, we have a single leader at a time and a bunch of validators that are receiving this data. So validators don't care how they get this data, right? Because they're deriving everything from the data directly. So this leader can broadcast, 1/n validators worth of data to each one, and then they exchange it. So that is effectively BitTorrent, and you can scale this out to a log, tree structure, right? So the fan out of whatever your fan out is, we verified this somewhere about 200. That means that in the second layer you have about 40,000 nodes. So with only 2 hops. So our finality grows with the log of the network size. And this fan out can be pretty huge.
Is this topology like set or it changes all the time?
It changes all the time. Yeah. There's no how you get placed is stake based. So based on your stake. But effectively, we try to get this group to be all the top stake nodes and then everyone else.
Yeah.
And the protocol is designed such that you receive this data partially from the network and it's padded with the ratio coding. So if X percentage of the nodes are, malicious or send you bad data or just don't do nothing, if that percentage is below the ratio coding, you should be able to recover the full data set. So kind of now this looks like a wireless network, which is like 12 years of Qualcomm actually helps here.
So
Go ahead.
is the leader? So I'm assuming leader gets rotated as well, right?
So here's the fun part. Now things get interesting. So rotation, right? And this really goes into the consensus portion. So imagine we take this timeline and we divide it up into slots. And these are just basically counters, right? Proof of history counter. So this is 1 million, this is 2 million, whatever. At every point, at every slot, there's a single leader that can transmit. Right? So this looks like time division multiple access TDMA, one of the earliest wireless protocols. We've effectively taken the rest of time and split it up into slots where any single leader can be the only one that transmits. So what that means is me as a validator, I either receive a transmission from this leader, right? Or potentially, if I fail to reassemble the packets, I generate a virtual tick or a virtual history. Because I can derive the history from the last point that I've observed by simply appending hashes with no data to it, right? So now we have kind of this protocol where the network either receives the data or fails to receive it, but it doesn't stop.
But so let's think from perspective of validator too.
Yeah.
So I presume those ticks happen rather frequently, right?
Yeah.
So if I wait first, if I wait until I'm confident I didn't receive the data before I start computing hashes.
No, you always compute them.
Oh, I constantly. So every validator constantly computes hashes, but then we're burning trees again, right?
No, just 1 core per node.
I see.
Yeah.
It's less of the tree.
Less trees.
Yeah. Insignificant amount of trees.
Right. But then once we get here, now we have all the interesting things such as why would I not always pretend that I never received the message?
Yeah, so this is where things get actually where you see branching. Is the second leader, right, is either observed a virtual ledger or a real one, and they get to transmit. And this is derived either from here or from here, right? So as the third one now then spans this this third one, right? That every time there's a new leader, a new slot, they have a number of options to pick from the previous thing that they've observed. So the branching, kind of starts blowing up here. And how we reduce it is I can kind of show you a different tree. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Right. Pretty much like
Right. Every leader either received the previous leader transmission and says, okay, I received the data, validated it, now I'm going to transmit. Or they fail to, and they've created a virtual ledger, and they transmit from that one.
They could have. So there's options where they received one before, one before, etc. Right. So there's
Right, because at any point,
how lagging they are.
right. So at any point, right, kind of L1. So this one sends data, and L2 gets to decide, well, did I receive the data or did I receive the virtual bit? Right. So this one goes to T or V, right? T or V. And L3 is over here. So the path here, right, can come from as if L2 failed to observe L1, right? So they chose V, and L3 actually saw, also failed to observe L1, L2, and chose T as well. And the only way this is chosen is if both of them fail to observe L1. Does that make sense? Because if L2 transmits data and this node observed a failure for L1 and this data depends on this one, it cannot verify that this is correct, right? So it actually skips it and says, I'm going to branch. I'm going to prove that I've actually generated enough hashes up to now. And
so you're saying what could happen is that L2 did transmit.
Yeah.
So L2 does not L2 only transmits its own portion. It doesn't transmit the portion from L1.
Yeah, correct.
And so L3, in theory, might have received L2 without receiving L1, and still choose to skip both of them.
Yeah, because it cannot verify them.
Makes sense.
Right? I mean, there's repair happening and stuff like that, but the idea is that this node may actually fail to receive both. And because it failed to receive both, its only option is to assume both have failed, right? And what each node does is whenever they observe, transmission data such that they vote on it, they reset their POH to start running from there. So at any point, the last thing you voted on, that's your kind of starting point, and you start producing hashes. And you could overrun basically everybody else up until it's your turn to transmit, and that could be 10 slots, it could be 5 slots, it could be 0, and then you transmit that plus all the virtual ticks you've generated, and you transmit that to the network. So the network, when receiving your data, can actually derive it back to, this is actually came from here, and here's the proof of history that shows that you waited X amount of time.
And what does the fork choose rule? So let's say I see L3, and so L3 is sending me skip, transmit, the proof
Yes.
that it's a transmit here.
Yeah.
But I also see L2 that sent me effectively transmit, V transmit.
Yep.
Right, but then obviously
right.
L2 sent it earlier, right? So I observed it in the past. Which one do I choose?
Well,
so when I install L2,
so now we get to the fun part, fork selection.
Yeah, fork choose rule.
So imagine you're a validator, right? Let's go back a little bit to how consensus works to kind of give a bigger, broader picture. So you have this proof history ledger, and imagine it's just forking, kind of at a very high level, right? It's forking all the time. And I have some votes here, right? Every time I vote, each vote is for a particular height of the ledger. And this vote starts with a lockout, let's say 2. Let's say I vote again. Now this vote is a lockout of 2, and this one is a lockout of 4, right? So I vote again, this becomes 4, this becomes 8, this becomes 2. The idea is that every time I vote, my votes exponentially stack. My lockouts exponentially grow. So this kind of gives us the same behavior as proof of work, right? We're not a PBFT or BFT solution, right? We're availability, so we're using kind of this threshold approach. But the threshold isn't based on electricity, right? It's actually based on time. And fundamentally, when you look at it, it's almost like a trade-off between availability and consistency. You can't cheat CAP theorem, right? Yeah. So literally you're trading here, what you're saying is, I will drop my availability for 8 units of time to break this consistency.
I see. So a couple questions. Votes, is it, the voting is
Virtual.
virtual, right? So when I'm as a leader,
Every
Making some
validator, when they observe your data, they decide to vote on it, and they're voting with a stake
and that vote is going to be stored on the
ledger sometime
On the
in the
ledger.
future.
in the future.
Yeah.
But so let's say that so leaders.
So this vote, maybe have been recorded
So you
here
actually
Right.
submit
Yeah.
information to the next leader that, hey, I voted
to the
on-
network. So
But doesn't it mean that per block you need to store 40,000 votes?
you could compress them with BLS signatures if
I
you
see.
wanted to,
I
but
see. So that,
we just
okay.
we don't care about data. We have a solution for data. So for all the data you want,
Yeah.
because we are our goal is to do 100,000 transactions per second, like steady state.
Makes
And right
sense.
now that's 200,000.
Mm-hmm.
So
Cool. And so for me to fully understand, this lookup means that if this vote is recorded,
yeah,
and at some point within so 8 is
10 units of time.
units of time. So without lots of generality, let's say
Yeah.
it's those millions of hashes, right?
Yeah.
So if someone else observes me having a competing vote within less than
Yes.
that period of time, there's some
Exactly.
flashing happening. Or
Yeah, so if this is a vote for this particular branch and you voted here, right,
Mhm.
then you get slashed.
I
And
see,
it's
makes
frozen, whatever,
Makes
right?
sense.
You're effectively prevented from voting again.
Makes sense. And so
For the whole
Slashing,
have.
yeah, slashing is one thing we're looking at. Interestingly, all we need to do is actually just freeze you freeze your account, right? From getting rewards or from voting.
Mm-hmm.
It's as effective as slashing in terms of keeping the network steady.
Well, you can move the money to different account.
No, it's like frozen. You can't touch
You
it
cannot touch the phone.
for like 6 months,
Okay.
right? So
But then if I voted, let's say I voted 30 times in a row. Right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
this time my lockup
it's
is
4 billion.
for all practical purposes infinite.
Exactly. So
But then let's say rework happened and actually, like this branch was abandoned.
when
or
was
you're
the
saying
last
that's
time?
impossible?
When's the last time Bitcoin reordered 32?
I don't like Bitcoin. Let's use Vertcoin as an example, right?
So that was an attack, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So PBFT systems just freeze,
I see.
right? For us, 2 to the 32 in time units, we can define that as meaning,
Infinite.
1 week.
All right, so that's a 1 week.
We don't care what it is, right?
Mhm.
We can effectively make a practical decision to say that if a 32 blocks deep reorg needs to occur, the network should basically do nothing for a week.
I see.
Because this should never happen, but if it needs to happen,
see.
let's put a human constraint on it, right?
I see. And so if some validator,
But that is
if it happens that majority of validators ended up on a different fork, but someone
yeah.
happened to have those 30 blocks, then we sacrifice this validator for a week effectively.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Something like that. That's something we can effectively decide and even make it a network parameter that the network chooses.
And you have some nice finality proofs that say that, if I saw like 64.
In
Days
simulation,
in a row.
it converges really quickly.
But they have like a nice written proof in LaTeX that says that if I saw 64 blocks.
The
We have
program
RFCs
is-
in GitHub, so it's all open source.
Cool.
Even all the awards are open source, so feel free to file an
Scrutinize it,
issue.
scrutinize
Yeah, scrutinize it. File issues. Look at the simulation and
Do you have simulation with adversaries?
yeah. Well, so that's the really interesting part. So imagine you guys can observe this happening. So
Can you use black instead?
yeah, sure. So when I vote here, these lockouts double,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now this is 4, this is 8, and this is 16. So that means that I can't really vote on any of these branches. And let's say this is a dead branch, right? I have to wait until this point to actually vote. But let's say a bunch of stuff happened and I actually voted here. What actually happens is, and let's say this lockout actually expired here, right? So this vote is expired too,
Mhm.
right? So the network, AWS had a sneeze and things stopped working, right? And I only ended up voting here. The actual lockouts are like a stack, and this stack is cleared, and now your lockout is 2 again, and this is still 16.
I see.
So,
But then by the time this is 8, on the next time I vote, this becomes 32.
only when this is 8.
I see.
So the way it works is you have effectively you're building a tower. Like I initially called it lock tower because I thought that was a cute
Cool
name.
name.
Yeah. So if this gets white, this starts at 2,
And then you just
And
build
then-
that, yeah.
right? And then there needs to be 2 and 4, right? And until it's fully rebuilt, you don't actually get to, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32.
Mhm.
So the idea here is that anytime you submit a vote, if this vote is at a point that is past any of the lockouts here, you clear the whole stack and you start over. And this allows you to progressively kind of undo your work. So when you vote here and you commit to this branch for 32 lockouts, you're saying that I'm going to effectively be unavailable for X amount of time to break this consistency, right? So when that actually happens, you remove this vote and you start rebuilding the stack again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense.
And this allows everybody to enroll. What also is interesting is that I can say that at 32 lockout, I want to observe 50% of the network to be at the same branch. And I can make a greedy choice. This is not even network enforced.
So you observe, by the time you observe 50% already voted on this branch, you'll vote? Or
I will not double my lockout past 32 on this branch unless I observe 50% plus of the
Of
network.
votes in front.
Right.
Makes
And
sense.
if I don't observe this just gets expired, and
Yeah.
eventually it gets totally expired.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that is effectively how the nodes in the network can force to be in the same branch. It's because they pick some branch behind, right? That's at a expiration of 1 hour, and they say that they will not commit to a branch on the network unless an hour ago we see that 50+% of the stake pool has committed as well.
And the topmost vote, what is the lockout on the topmost vote?
It's short, so 1 or 2 slots.
1 or 2 slots. But
you
can
can,
I not do the following? Can I not vote? Wait for it to expire, vote again, wait for it to expire, so never build
Right.
my tower.
So the reward actually comes in 4, 8, 16,
When you have a lot
2 to
more.
the 32, right? So when you double again, this is dequeued, and that's your reward. So you
I
actually
see.
have to.
Oh, you need to have the tower.
So you actually have to commit to.
so build to one branch for a while.
Right. So what this actually means is that we're kind of finalizing this.
In 32 blocks.
Right. So 32 blocks ago, we said that this is the final branch, and this is the thing that matters, right? It's the thing that the network will, take a big loss.
Yeah.
to
Okay, so
convert.
50% of people voted on this, but not all of them have a large tower in it, right?
Right.
It's just they voted, so some of them have less to lose.
Right. But your threshold would be set somewhere here, somewhere in the middle.
Oh, so I'm not going to be just saying if 50% voted, I'm going to be saying
Right.
50%
In this many blocks.
are like this deep
Right.
into this
Yeah.
Right.
branch.
So-
So it's like,
Going back to this, right? What I can do is I can actually withhold my vote and observe both L2, right? So I can observe both of these. We can't. There's no way for us to stop nodes from doing this.
but L2 is not a leader here, right?
No, L2 was the leader, right? They
On the
transmitted
previous
this
one, yeah.
branch,
That's for
right?
2.
So I'm more interested in the case where, let's say L2 was the leader at this slot.
Yeah.
Right, so this is the slot.
And
for
L3 had a faster ASIC and overran.
Oh no, so let's say this is time, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So L3 published it here, and
Yeah.
nothing was published here.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I, as L4, will I always choose the one that was published
So-
later? Because let's say L3 is complete.
So the greedy choice that we want the network to make is to, if they have multiple branches, right? It should be unlikely because we're using this forced delay, right? To actually have L3 generate X amount of data before they transmit. But they can cheat, they can use a faster ASIC. Or this one could just be slower, right? So when you actually observe 2 branches, you should pick the one that maximizes the network reward. So maximizes the lockup.
I see.
So because you can examine both branches, you can compute all the votes, and you can say that branch 1 is the one that actually
Has a bunch of votes.
has the most lockout.
But isn't it counterintuitive? The higher the network reward is, the more inflated the Solana token, the less value is of my
Personal
But the
leader.
more committed, the more there is you can, given these lockouts, you can actually very easily compute economic finality,
makes sense.
right? And the more economic finality there is in a branch, that's the branch that you want to be a part of because that's the one where you actually get a reward. All the other ones die, right?
I see. Well, it's not sort of immediately obvious to me that, like, I would multiply economic finality by how much the token is diluted,
dilution,
right?
yeah.
And
But-
it sort of sounds like economic finality.
Presumably dilution will be so small compared
yeah.
to the reward you'll get.
Right.
Like the
It's like proof
expected
of work.
value.
It's like proof of work, right? Every block dilutes Bitcoin, but you don't want to mine on a fork that is not going to be accepted into the main tree because you're wasting electricity, right?
Mhm.
So similarly here, you want to commit to a fork that has the most economic finality because that's the one that's most likely to survive. Because really for us, lockout is economic finality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you compute economic finality, do you just count those guys who just dropped beyond 2 to the 32nd? Or are you also like trying to predict how much people will get in the future?
The way it's written right now is it just basically adds up all the lockouts on the branches and picks the one. So that's kind of a rough approximation.
But then consider, so let's say everybody has, the speed of ASICs is the same for everybody.
Yeah.
Right, and so this is time, like the second zero, on the second zero, one of the leaders transmitted, right? And so L3 observed it and L2, but let's say L2 actually didn't see it, right? And then on second one, let's say it's once per second, neither of them, well actually let's say L2 did observe something. Yeah. On second two, L2 did observe something, and that continues for a while, right? So L3 has only one block it observed, and it could be produced by L3 itself and never distributed, right? But L2 has been building for a while.
Yep.
And then at some point, L3 publishes the transmit message.
Yep.
Again.
So this one would be effectively dropped by the network because everyone that saw this tease have voted. So the majority of the network that observed the data has voted, and when they observe this that doesn't include these votes, they can't actually
because
vote.
They've been voting.
Yeah.
And they're blocked out, right? Because now if I've observed three data transmissions, my lockout is somewhere here, right? So this guy is effectively like
makes sense.
This is basically packet loss.
Yeah, because so my point was that like this T is twice as important as any of this, but because there are many T's there.
Right. So because this leader didn't observe this T, they didn't vote on it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming that it's whatever the probability, whatever the majority of the network has observed, right? If the next leader is also in that majority, then it kind of continues.
But if this guy is like voted like for this and L3 included all those votes on the first T, and L2 like he didn't observe.
So intuitively think of it this way, right? I have some probability of success, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the next leader has some, other probability of success. If all of these are in the majority, then you continue kind of stacking votes. But as soon as somebody's in the minority, fail, this node fails, right? And the network has X amount of time to kind of get back to the majority state.
And another question. So,
does that make sense? Every time we rotate, there's some probability that you've observed the data, right?
Right.
And there's some probability that you're in the majority group. And as long as that's true and continues to be true, we kind of keep going forward.
So let's say in the chain that I observe, the first leader transmitted the message.
Yeah.
And the second leader says, let me think. How does V even appear?
The second leader is producing its own POH from the last vote that they've taken.
From the last vote.
So when they transmit, they also prove that they didn't see 5 transmissions.
Oh, I see. So let's say TV effectively means that so let's say I'm a leader. I saw this transmission.
Which is
so I'm leader 3, for example, right?
Exactly.
I saw transmission from leader 1.
Yeah.
And then I didn't see anything from leader 2.
Yep.
Do people vote on this V?
No, they don't.
No, that's
So votes only accumulate when something is actually transmitted.
Yeah. Because these are virtual, right?
Yeah.
They have no data and they can be derived from any point in the state.
So in my hypothetical example, this thing has like 1 vote, which was never doubled because nobody is voting on it. While here, this message, even though it was published later, by this time has multiple people having gates.
Yeah.
I see. So like, usually the chain which has more transmissions will be chosen effectively.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
see.
So this kind of saves us in the case where somebody is like built an asynchronous circuit in their like basement lab, basement fab, and they're like generate a
Just
bunch
overran
of these,
a
right?
bunch, yeah.
Overran and then do a T here. One, because this will pop a bunch of rewards, so it'll have lower economic finality. And two, right? That's exactly kind of how.
Nobody can vote
Yeah,
for that.
yeah.
But it's possible to have like if you have some portion of the stake, you can like flip the thing, right? Like what is the portion of the stake that you need to
So
like
this is like
to
a
get to vote on this?
this is like an actual censorship attack.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're L4 and you're some portion of the stake, you can potentially just overrun the previous leader every time.
Yeah.
So you do a transmission here that
And then you
that
ignore
kill-
everybody that
Yeah,
you do
that
that.
kills whatever this node
Yeah.
is, right?
So
And if you're clever, I mean, you would include all the validator messages except the ones you want to censor.
Mhm.
And this should be the majority network. So this is like the actual censorship attack. The only way we fight that is the VDFs will progressively approach whatever secret VDF you can build in speed. So, the difference between V0 and V1 might be 2x, but between V1 and V2 is going to be 50%, between V3 and V4, 5%. That's fine.
But so what, like right now, for example, let's say everybody has the same homogeneous hardware. What is the portion of the stake you need if you let's say you have 2 leaders right now, right?
So the rotation is stake weighted.
Stake weighted.
Yeah. So we the active set, right, is computed from the network. So whatever it is, we compute this and then we decide this is the new schedule. And you just rotate all the leaders. And even if you're a low stake node with crappy hardware, the only thing that happens is a packet loss. So our goal is to make these slots as fast as possible. In theory, it could be 100 milliseconds because this node could have pre-computed all the data right before their slot and started transmitting, right?
Still takes like 200 milliseconds to
Yeah.
get to China, but
You can pipeline it, right? So when it goes to China, right, they might actually be if
off
that
a little bit.
right if they're in the minority state group, they'll just get kind of censored out potentially.
So we're censoring China now.
Right, but it's permissionless, right? We can't really like
I think it's going to be that way though.
yeah.
Wait, so let's imagine an example where you have a one account that has 20% of stake, right?
So they would
And
appear
they'll be
20% of the time,
yeah.
1/5 of the time.
1/5 of the time, and then they also have 20% of all the votes. So can they pretty much do like transmit, ignore, transmit, and they add like 20% of their votes in this branch? So can they censor like the rest of the?
No, because if the rest of the network is observing this, which includes this, then they can't choose this unless, this node can choose this, right? But effectively, everybody else can't choose this branch
But
because
like
they've already voted.
others felt like let's imagine before that they all on the same branch, right?
Right.
So there will be folks that have voted for this as well.
Right.
So you accumulate all that, and you're on 20%.
But they would have to skip, right?
Yeah.
Those folks would have to actually actively participate in this. If they voted on this, they cannot move that vote over.
Yeah, they cannot move their over.
So they're locked out, right? From their perspective, this transmission is a failure because it doesn't include their previous vote, so it's a separate fork.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't switch over until this expires, right?
So yeah, but
They would have to effectively, you can bribe them and tell them, hey, don't vote.
don't vote here. Yeah.
And I'll pay for your rewards.
Well,
But
or
you're
like
losing-
just
losing-
don't vote at all. Like
Right.
postpone it a little bit.
But you don't even have to do that. You can just tell them that, and if people agree, then what's the point? the main thing, so what's interesting is in our simulation, if you have all the nodes, instead of picking the branch with the most reward, pick the branch with the least reward. But still not allow, like, let's say, I think, was it 256? Not allow this lockout to be under 50% of the network, right? So nodes that just want to disrupt the network, they can't actually vote on branches that die because then they just lock themselves out from the network, right? So the thing that they choose is to continue voting in a branch that becomes the main trunk, but always pick out of multiple branches the worst one, the one that has the least amount of economic finality. This network still moves forward, just at about, like, with everybody being parasitic, it moves forward at about like 10% of the rate. So that is really cool. That means that if the hardware is actually, uniform, right, we can actually run this thing to be fairly censorship resistant and fairly kind of attack resistant to parasitic nodes.
That's like if everybody's parasitic, pretty much, you said.
Yeah. It still moves forward, which is cool, right?
Yeah, that's good.
Versus like Bitcoin, if everybody's voting, if everybody's
Just choosing their own branch,
right,
yeah, just like
it actually doesn't move forward.
So I have a couple, one short question is, you need randomness, right? What is,
No, we don't use randomness.
also, how are leaders selected? Like, how's the order of leaders?
Randomness is hard, right?
That much idea.
It's very hard to build a random source that is actually secure.
Unless you have a VDF.
Which you do.
So we do, but again, like our VDF is biased because every time we submit a message, that creates a bias. So you could, in theory, like what would be easy for us to provide is, right, you have like, TT, but you're also, everybody's computing these virtual branches from the last transmission. What you can do is use this random value based on this for this block.
That sounds like a terrific idea.
It's a little weak because anyone with just an ASIC that's two twice as
Oh,
fast.
they can predict the random values.
Right.
I see.
So you need like many VDs pretty much.
Yeah, but that doesn't work because then everybody has to run like 32 cores worth of VDFs, and that is problematic. So for us, we don't use randomness. What we actually use is just the number of counts, the height, as the seed to like pseudo-random to just scramble this active set.
I see.
So it's really just round robin with a little bit of reordering.
I see. But like the person, if I have 10x more stake than you, am I going to be?
You can actually
spread out
splitting the accounts, no?
Every time this is rotated over a long time, you will be, right? Because this is random enough. It's just predictable.
Hopefully.
Unbiased. It's totally predictable, but unbiasable.
I see.
Wait, but you said the number of accounts. So let's say
The height. So this is like, height 100 million, and this is height 200 million. That's the seed to like some random.
So,
But if this is the seed, can I not? Like
you know in
effectively,
advance everybody that's going to be scheduled for the rest of the time.
you know in advance everybody who's going to be scheduled.
everybody's participating
Always.
regarding their like they don't decide if they want to participate or not.
When they stake, right? There's an active set.
Yeah, so you can decide not to stake if you know, like
Yeah.
you can pretty much decide to stake or not. Just split your account and.
Yeah.
So let's say
You don't have to stake, but everybody that's staked that wants to be in the rotation says that they're in the
but let's say
rotation.
that in practice, 99% of people are just the same who maintain the network, right? Because it seems like if you already, let's call it mining, if you're already mining, it doesn't make sense to stop mining. And if you're not mining yet, like presumably not that many people will be onboarding, especially when the network is sufficiently operational, then it feels like what I can do is I can create 1 million accounts and then start using combinations of those accounts to see how introducing those into the set of validators influence the order.
Right.
And then once I find the good one, I just move my assets in there.
So just to make this practical, this is computed over like 2 weeks.
Right. Okay. So I need to rely on the fact that within 2 weeks nobody else.
Right. And also your staking requires like 2 weeks warm up, 2 weeks cool down. We just stick human timeouts there, and that's it.
This is suspiciously similar to threshold proof of stake.
That is pretty much what we use.
That's
yes.
practically what we use
For what?
for beacon chain.
for our
Okay.
staking mechanism.
Cool. It's all the same. Everybody's like, we're all circling the same
ideas.
Not
Cool.
the train.
So the second question is, so the 40,000 nodes you drew before on the tree, each of them has a GPU, right, effectively, because each of them needs to validate. Now let's say I'm a point of sale terminal.
Yes.
What sort of other
thin
nodes?
clients?
Yeah.
This is the complicated part. So this is where Justin's magic VDF that has asymptotic verification
Would be great.
would be really useful. But because that's not ready, the way we're doing this is your validation message can point to the previous validation set, right? So what you as a thin client, in fact, this is what we're doing for kind of our like signing enclave. You can observe that X amount of, you start with some set of validators, right? As you trusted validators. Like you've observed the network you've done at a station, right? This is my set of validators. You can observe sets in the future of votes that simply point back. So now you know that like these guys are derived from the trusted set because they're a subset of this.
I see.
And they voted on the branch that you care about.
So you're not validating the hashes per se or the history. You just trust
a
validators.
set of validators to maintain it for you.
This is weaker, definitely weaker than validating the time. The problem here too is what you need to do is like actual transaction validation, right? Like I sent you a transaction and you want to quickly verify it, and this appears somewhere here in the middle of all the hashes, all the hashes. So what we need to do is actually point this back up here through like a Merkle tree.
Oh, by the way, is transaction in the history, is it just a confirmation that it was received, or that's a confirmation that this is valid as of this point?
This is valid as
This is valid. Okay, so transaction is only included if it's validated.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So you have an account model, or do you take so?
We have an account model. You can you can, in theory, you can submit a transaction that pays out to two different accounts.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, account model will also do everything. Yes.
Yeah.
But like then for account model, do you include a transaction and a new Merkle root pretty much after this transaction is applied?
We just don't allow them to be in if they fail.
Yeah, but
because if this is just a payment, you can do that. But for a smart contract, you would need to you would have to like print out the state, right? And that's like a much more complicated model.
But if I just join the network, to start validating, I need to like rerun all of the transactions from the beginning of time.
These validation messages include effectively the signature of the account state.
I see. Okay.
Right. So you can look at the network and see, everybody's stake is voting for these signatures. Go give me a checkpoint.
And that's like a Merkle root.
Yeah.
So voting is pretty much.
No, yeah, but it is.
And then, so when I'm recomputing the hashes on the GPU, right? So every now and then, so let's say I'm computing. So let's say, like I was the leader, and I was like, this is my hash 1.
Yeah.
And then the SHA of hash 1 is my hash 2.
Yeah.
And then the SHA of hash 2 is my hash 3.
Yeah.
But then for hash 4, I also have some transaction.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is my hash 4.
So the ledger output.
This is also running on GPU, right? So GPU has this like branch which says if it has a transaction.
The data that you're like submitting to the GPU is
just
kind of like just hashes.
Hashes of transactions.
Yeah. But this is like a big blob of data, and we hash that.
I see.
Right, and then we submit the hash into here.
Oh, so if there's no transaction, that it's like a
0. Yeah.
There's some sort of hash. There's some sort of value there as well. I see.
So do you do it for each one? So you have like H1 0. Like every time, for a million times, or you just.
So we don't store the zeros.
Oh, you just like ignore the zeros.
We don't store the zeros on chain. The ledger data structure just contains the, effectively number of counts, number of hashes, number of POH hashes, the current hash, and then an optional hash of the blob.
The hash of the blob adds a specific.
At this count. So when
I
you're,
see,
when
I
you're
see, I see.
replaying this, you just simply stick it in there. Yeah.
But you also have, the transactions attached to this data structure.
Yeah.
For this specific stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then how many do you have? Like, pretty much the question is.
So blob is 64 kilobytes. Depends on the transaction size because they're smart contracts that are variable.
Yeah.
Right now, our maximum is 512 bytes. But like a simple move, the smallest one we can come up with is like 176 bytes
Per transaction.
Per transaction.
for just unique payment.
Wait, so
Yeah.
I'm just trying to
One
compute
payment.
how much bandwidth do you need to GPU to verify all that
Like modern day GPUs have 16 gigabits per second bandwidth. This is
from CPU from the
yeah. PCI 3 is 1 gigabit per lane. You have 16 lanes.
But you don't need to send the actual transaction, you're just sending the hash of it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
Well, we
I need to
actually
hash that first.
we actually do send the whole transaction data because you can't do that many signatures per second on
I
CPUs.
see.
So we
Oh, you verify signatures there too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's our defense against DDoS is just verifying signature many more signatures per second than the network can actually transmit.
Well,
That won't stop like a router attack, right? Like if everybody's flooding like some upstream component,
yeah.
but at each node we can actually verify way more signatures per second than
yeah, you can transmit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, presumably you can flood the network from many nodes into but
shall we wrap up here?
is there any other parts you want to mention? Like for smart contracts,
Yeah, that is a totally fun problem itself. Because so our contracts, what is a transaction for us? Transaction is, well, first of all, running like the actual like bottleneck in computation isn't CPU, it's memory, right? Like the problem with making things go fast is just memory pipelining through the system. Like if you look at just operating systems and how processes run, like what you're dealing with is memory throughput, like caches, like all this other stuff. So how do we make this fast? Is every transaction specifies a bunch of public keys. And these keys are pointers to accounts, right?
mm-hmm.
And these accounts have some data associated with them. And you can think of it as user data, right? But the way I think of it is we have a operating system with a single address space. It just happens to be the size of public keys, right? So 256-bit address space. But also memory protection. So these accounts are assigned to a process. Right?
Mm-hmm.
By process, I mean, there's some account here whose data contains program code. And this code is just code, it has no state. So this program code is a state transition function over these accounts. And the accounts that are assigned to this is the only code that can modify the data. So whenever you do an assignment, this data's bits are 0, and this code is the only thing that can flip those bits, right? So every time you submit a transaction, it does some bit flipping here. So what else it can do is it can move tokens around, however it wants. And it can also pay out tokens to external accounts. Yeah.
But this is done outside of this code, right?
No, this code does this modification, and then when we, this actual program could run on GPUs, right? Our bytecode is like very, very simple. It's called Berkeley Packet Filter. It's designed for porting into any architecture you want. So we can actually port it to Spear 5. So we can execute all these programs on GPUs and then
So
on
just page in this data first into
Yeah.
GPU.
go fetch it, go run all this stuff in parallel, get the modifications back, and the only thing we're validating is that if the data's been modified, that it was done by this program, right? And if there's tokens that have been moved around, that tokens going out were moved, that this program didn't spend any external tokens, and then the total sum of tokens is the same.
But the tokens here are meaning native tokens.
Yeah, the actual thing that pays for CPU and storage and whatever.
So if you're for example moving some other
Yeah, that's just data modification,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
state, that's opaque. We don't really know what that is. But because every transaction effectively specifies all the memory regions it needs to access, we can schedule
you can
all the
schedule
non-overlapping
efficiently
ones,
very
yeah.
much,
And what languages compile to that bytecode?
It's the LLVM backend, so anything from LLVM. The backend is kind of weak. It's a little weak. Doesn't support like all the features yet, but that's just it's just work.
So it's how so if you have any LLVM code to GPU, why are we still writing CUDA?
No, you can. I think
It's
I'm pretty sure
limited,
CUDA
right?
uses LLVM.
Yeah.
The problem isn't that. It's that we have a bytecode that is very stable, right? This is a very stable bytecode that's going to be on chain forever.
Yeah.
And we can port it to whatever architecture happens to be the fastest one. It may be for some use cases that Spear 5 is the fastest thing, but for others it's not, like x86. So we want to really keep it in this very simple to manage intermediate state.
So right now, but you execute all these programs on GPU, even though maybe some of them may be way more efficient on CPU because of SSC instructions.
Right now it's all CPU based.
Oh, it's all CPU based.
Yeah, so do you guys want to write some JIT to Spear 5?
Yeah. I mean,
You can use the engine in your blockchain, in your chain.
Yeah.
So what's awesome about like using a GPU for contract execution is if you have a spike like CryptoKitties,
Yeah.
right? The same program code can execute many different transactions at the same time on the GPU because you have this like massive amounts of lanes for the same code. So if you had a CryptoKitties like spike, you actually don't use a different thread per transaction. Use one thread that goes over this enormously wide lane.
Yeah, and then in parallel execute everything else.
So that is like the really awesome thing.
But
It's
you
that
can do
like-
that on CPU too, right? You just schedule based on data access, right?
Not with CPU threads, because you have to use like vectorized code. So like something like AVX.
Mm-hmm.
But the AVX pipeline is like really limited for massive parallelization compared to a GPU one.
Right.
So in theory, right, the cost to execute like a more popular program should actually be lower for the network.
Because it's free cache now.
Yep.
Like you don't need to page data every
And
time.
right, and you're effectively just reusing these lanes. We'll see if that pays out in practice. That's yet to be measured.
Yeah.
But it looks like it'll work in theory.
But this is done on like 100, in your case, 100 millisecond increments, right? So presumably like.
No, like, so you have a bunch of transactions, they're all for CryptoKitties, right?
Yeah.
There's
but-
one contract that's the CryptoKitties contract.
But I'm a leader for 100 milliseconds, right? So I collect some transactions, execute them, stick it in, and like I don't need to do it anymore. So
But if
I will page out.
that's like if that's the popular transaction that's being thrown at
it's
the
gonna be
network,
like there all the time.
you can leave this program in cache, right?
Mhm.
Because you know that like, hey, everybody's flooding the network with these CryptoKitties transactions, right?
Alright, cool.
Those are like levels of optimization that I don't know if we need yet, but they're fun to worry about.
So let's finish with a few non-technical questions. When is the mainnet?
Oh, that's the hardest question. So our goal is to be FC, effectively kind of end of January, and then mainnet will be driven, I think, by maybe more legal side in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, let's wrap up here.
Yeah,
All right.
thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Super
Asking
fun.
questions. Yep.
Cool.
Cool. Great.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions on YouTube and
Yeah.
yeah, we'll follow up from there. Okay, bye.
Cool.